Now we're going to begin our look at the Union in crisis. In section 1, we look at how the nation split apart. Our learning objective is to describe the causes of the secession of the southern states. So first, we have to realize that the issue of slavery really did divide the nation. The division between the North and South increased over the issue of slavery during the first half of the 19th century. Soon after the Mexican-American War, the debate over slavery intensified. Of particular concern were the new territories gained from Mexico. So this brings us to the Compromise of 1850, and this helped to settle the dispute temporarily. It was a series of 5 bills that passed Congress. In it, California was admitted as a free state, the slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia, New Mexico, which is including present-day Arizona and Utah territories, were organized under popular sovereignty, meaning that the people of the territory would determine for themselves whether or not slavery would be allowed. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed, making it a crime to assist runaway slaves. And Texas gave up some of its land to pay its debts. Now, particular concern was the Fugitive Slave Act, probably the most divisive part of this bill, because ultimately it allows Southerners to accuse African Americans in the North of being runaway slaves. And really, there was no way for them to really disprove this, and under this act, they could then be, in effect, taken back to slave territory. And of course, many Northerners as well were abolitionists and wanted to help those African Americans escape from slavery in the South to the North. And now it's now seen as being a crime, something that they don't feel too good about. So this increases tensions tremendously. Another act comes about known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is really put forth by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who supported the idea of popular sovereignty, and he proposed organizing 2 new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This Kansas-Nebraska Act outraged many Northerners. Many Whigs left the party and joined the Free Soil Party and other anti-slavery parties to form the Republican Party. Violence breaks out. Soon, violence broke out between supporters of slavery and abolitionists. Kansas became especially violent and was dubbed Bleeding Kansas. But violence wasn't limited to the general populace. South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks attacked Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate and beat him with a cane. Another divisive court decision came with the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, a slave, filed a lawsuit claiming that the fact that his owner had taken him to a free state made him a free man. In the Dred Scott versus Sandford decision, the Supreme Court ruled that slaveholders' Fifth Amendment property rights protect the slaveholders' rights even in a free state. And of course, this doesn't set well in the North, because in the North, they see this as really a violation. They don't have slavery in the North, and they're looking at the rights of the African American, and it's already bad in their minds that it is allowed, that slavery is allowed in the South, but now they can bring their slaves into the North and still maintain them or maintain their possession as property. And so once again, this continues to kind of ramp up the disagreements between the North and the South. Then another incident takes place that really begins to create a great deal of fear in the South and a lot of anger in the North. One slave who managed to make it out of slavery actually was able to be freed by his owner, had sought to free the rest of his family. His wife and children were owned by another slaveholder. And so he went to the north and began to work to try to buy the freedom of his family. And he's got this agreed upon price, but when he finally raises the money, partially through contributions made by other abolitionists, he returns to the South, to the slaveholder, to try to purchase the freedom of this slave, of his family, and finds that the price has now increased. And so, really feeling dejected and hopeless, he leaves and goes back home. And on the way, he runs into a man named John Brown. Now, John Brown is an abolitionist, but John Brown is also someone we would classify as a terrorist. Hoping to start a slave revolt, John Brown launched an attack on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And this freed slave joins his attack and actually ends up being the first member of John Brown's raiding party to be killed. In his pocket, they find letters from his wife. And so when those letters are circulated in the North, that continues to create more outrage in the North at the institution of slavery. But at the same time, this raid launched by John Brown really failed to spark a slave revolt as he had hoped, and U.S. Marines overtook the arsenal, captured Brown and his surviving followers. He was charged with treason against Virginia, and he was executed. Many Northerners once again viewed him as a hero, but in the South they viewed him as a terrorist, and really largely blamed the North, as many of them were abolitionists, for what happened. Now we're going to look at Lincoln's rise to the presidency. Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809 and later moved to Illinois. As a young man, he took a job on a riverboat delivering produce from Indiana to New Orleans. And it was here that he first witnessed a slave auction, and he was appalled by what he saw. In 1834, he was elected to the state legislature of Illinois. In 1846, he was elected to Congress, but he resigned in 1849 to practice law. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he decided to return to politics, and he organized the Illinois Republican Party and decided to run against Stephen Douglas for his seat in the Senate. And now we're going to look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln and Douglas engaged in a series of debates, and the debates focused on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln's anti-slavery message gained a national audience, and Douglas lost support in both the North and the South. And this brings us now to the election of 1860. Northern and Southern Democrats split over the issue of running Stephen Douglas. The Northern Democrats ran Douglas, while the Southern Democrats ran John C. Breckinridge. This split in the Democratic Party allowed Lincoln, the Republican nominee, to win the election. Northerners now controlled both houses of Congress, and the Union now had an anti-slavery president. After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Southerners were fearful of a Southern uprising. And while Republicans denounced the raid, many Southerners blamed Republicans because they were opposed to slavery. And the South saw Lincoln's victory as a victory for the abolitionists. South Carolina was the first state to secede. By February of 1861, 6 more Southern states voted to secede. So all in all, you have 7 Southern states that have decided to leave the Union, to leave the United States before Lincoln has even taken office. Modern elections take place in November, early November, and under the modern times, we do the presidential inauguration in January, January 20th to be specific. But at the time, inaugurations didn't take place until March. So Lincoln wins the 1860 election, but before he takes office in March of 1861, 7 states have voted to secede or to leave the United States. Now, there were some attempts made to try to save the Union. Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky suggested several amendments to the Constitution known as Crittendens Compromise. The amendments would guarantee slavery where it already existed, and it would reinstate the Missouri Compromise line, extending it all the way out to California. Slavery would be banned north of the line and protected south of the line. The compromise did not pass. A peace conference was held in February of 1861, but no secessionist states attended, and it failed to formulate a plan to save the Union. Delegates from the seceding states met, and on February 8, 1861, they declared themselves to be the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was chosen as the president of the Confederacy. And now we're going to be looking actually at the Civil War. Our learning objectives are to describe how the Civil War started, to explain the major advantages that each side had in the war, and to describe the strategy used by the North. In his inaugural speech, Lincoln told seceding states that he would not interfere with slavery where it existed. He said that he would not invade seceding states, but he would protect federal property. Confederate President Jefferson Davis demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter, but the fort's commander refused. Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, and the Civil War had begun. President Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers to serve in the Union Army. Southern states up north did not want to send troops to fight against other Southerners, and many seceded, starting with Virginia. And quickly the Confederate capital was moved to Virginia. Lincoln did not want the border states to secede, especially Maryland, because he didn't want Washington, D.C. to be surrounded by Confederate territory. Quite literally, if Maryland, which was a southern state, had fallen, really the nation's capital basically would be surrounded by the South. So, he imposed martial law, or where the military takes control of an area and suspends certain civil rights, on Baltimore to prevent Maryland's secession. Missouri voted to stay with the Union, but needed the support of federal forces. Kentucky remained neutral until the Confederate forces invaded, and then it voted to stay in the Union. Robert E. Lee was asked to command Union forces, but as a Virginian, he chose to support the Confederacy and led the Confederate forces instead. The South had a strong military tradition, as 7 of the 8 military schools were in the South. The South enjoyed the advantage of having several well-trained officers. But the North, on the other hand, had a strong naval tradition and enjoyed the advantage of a stronger navy. The North also had a much larger population to draw on for support and troops. The North also had a huge advantage in industry, granting it an economic advantage in supplying it with ammunition and other supplies more easily. The North also enjoyed more railroads. The South only had one. This brings us now to conscription, or the draft. To fill the need for more soldiers, Lincoln used conscription, drafting soldiers into the military. To enforce the militia law, Lincoln suspended writs of habeas corpus, or a person's right to not be imprisoned unless charged with a crime and given a trial. The Confederate Constitution's commitment to states' rights limited President Davis's ability to conduct the war. Many Southern leaders opposed the President Davis's forcing people to join the Army. They also opposed suspending writs of habeas corpus. looking at the different strategies. Davis wanted the South to wage a defensive war, but many Southerners were opposed to a defensive war, and aggressive attacks against the North resulted in many casualties. General Winfield Scott of the North implemented the Anaconda Plan, which included blocking Southern ports and sending gunboats down the Mississippi River to divide the Confederacy. So once again, the Anaconda Plan called for a blockade of Southern ports on the Atlantic. They wanted to isolate the Confederacy from European aid and trade and cut off the flow of supplies and equipment, money, food, and cotton. They hoped to exhaust Southern resources, forcing surrender, and control the Mississippi with Union gunboats. And once again, part of that goal was to divide the eastern part of the Confederacy from the western part. Now we look at the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederate forces scored a victory at the First Battle of Bull Run when reinforcements under Stonewall Jackson arrived. In February of 1862, Union General Ulysses S. Grant began a campaign to control the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River. Control of the rivers cut Tennessee in two and gave the Union a river route deep into Confederate territory. Union ships, led by David G. Farragut, captured New Orleans and gained control of the lower Mississippi River in April of 1862. After a series of Confederate setbacks, the Union was retreating. As Union troops withdrew, Lee attacked the Union forces defending Washington in the Second Battle of Bull Run. The South forced the North to retreat, bringing Confederate troops within 20 miles of Washington. Believing that the only way to get the North to accept the independence of the South was to invade the North, Robert E. Lee took his troops invaded Maryland. Union troops took position along Antietam Creek, east of Lee. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest one-day battle of the war. The Union forces inflicted so many casualties on the Confederate Army that Lee decided to retreat to Virginia. Encouraged by the Union victory at Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, freeing all slaves in states still in rebellion after January 1st, 1863. This turned the war into a war to end slavery and deterred Britain and France from entering the war as they opposed slavery. Women played a major role in the war effort as well. Besides managing family farms and businesses, women contributed to the Civil War by serving as nurses and doctors to the wounded at the battlefield. Clara Barton and many other women in both the North and the South served as nurses during the war. After the Emancipation Proclamation, thousands of African Americans served in the Union Army. Grant and his forces attacked the Confederacy at Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Confederate forces surrendered on July 4, 1863. The defeat split the Confederacy in two. In June of 1863, Lee invaded the North, where his army met the Union cavalry. On July 1st, 1863, the Confederates pushed the Union troops out of Gettysburg. The Union forces had lost 23,000 at Gettysburg. The Confederates had 28,000 casualties, more than one-third of Lee's army. The Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the war in the East. Lee's forces were on the defensive from that point on. President Lincoln came to Gettysburg in November of 1863 to dedicate a military cemetery. The speech he gave, known as the Gettysburg Address, is one of the most famous speeches in history. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman marched his troops from Chattanooga towards Atlanta in late August of 1864. The Confederate forces evacuated from Atlanta to avoid being trapped. On November 15, 1864, Sherman began his march to the sea. His troops cut a path of destruction through Georgia in which they ransacked homes, burned crops, and killed cattle. They reached the coast and seized Savannah on December 21st, 1864. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution banning slavery in the United States passed the House of Representatives on January 31st, 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Under the terms of the surrender, the Confederate soldiers would not be tried for treason. On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot and killed Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. More than 625,000 Americans were killed in the war, slightly less than half of the total of all Americans killed in the history of all U.S. wars. The Union was preserved and the strength of the states was diminished, and slavery had ended. Now, looking at the destruction of the war, once again, as I mentioned, 625,000 Americans killed. That's very close to 1/2 of the total losses in all U.S. wars combined, from the Revolutionary War all the way through our present conflict in Afghanistan. Families were torn apart by this war, as sometimes family members fought on opposing sides. And keep in mind, one of the things that made this war so deadly, of course, for us, is that all of the casualties, really, on both sides were American. So, but, like I said, by far, this is the deadliest war in U.S. history. Now we're going to begin our look at Reconstruction. Our learning objective is to summarize the major developments of the Reconstruction period. So now that the war was over, the South needed to be rebuilt from the destruction, and the terms and conditions by which the Southern states would be readmitted to the Union had to be determined. This period is known as Reconstruction. President Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction called for a general amnesty, or pardon, to all of the Southerners who took an oath of loyalty to the United States and accepted the Union's proclamations concerning slavery. After 10% of the state's voters in the 1860 presidential election had taken the oath, the state could organize a new state government. But there was another group that took a different approach, known as the Radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts led the Radical Republicans in Congress, and they did not want to reconcile with the South. The Radical Republicans had three main goals. 1, prevent Confederate leaders from returning to power after the war. 2, they wanted a strong Republican Party in the South. And 3, political equality for African Americans by protecting their right to vote. This brings us now to the Wade-Davis bill. Moderate Republicans thought Lincoln's plan was too lenient on the South and that the Radical Republicans' plan was too harsh. The Wade-Davis bill was introduced and passed in Congress. It required the majority of adult males, or of adult white men in a former Confederate state, to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. The state could then hold a constitutional convention to create a new state government. Each state would have to uphold the ban on slavery and ban any former Confederate official from voting or holding public office. The bill was vetoed by President Lincoln. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau. The purpose of the Bureau was to provide food and clothing for the newly freed slaves. Also, the Bureau worked to find jobs for the newly freed slaves. After Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became president. Johnson was chosen as Lincoln's running mate because he was from the South. Johnson had his own plan for offering amnesty to Southerners, and he would offer amnesty to any Southerner who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and would return their property, excluding Confederate officials, who could personally seek a pardon from the president. Johnson granted pardons to thousands of Southerners. Many members of Congress were angry that several former Confederate officers and political leaders were elected to Congress. Radical and moderate Republicans voted to reject these new members of Congress. The new Southern state legislatures passed laws known as Black Codes that severely restricted the rights of African Americans. While the codes varied from state to state, the effect was to keep African Americans in conditions similar to slavery. And now we come to congressional Reconstruction. In March of 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The act gave citizenship to all persons born in the United States except Native Americans, and it gave African Americans the right to own property and equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and it provided for equal protection under the law and due process. Congress passed the amendment in June of 1866, and it was sent to the states for ratification. Then we hit the period of military Reconstruction. In March of 1867, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act, doing away with Johnson's Reconstruction programs. Former Confederate states, except for Tennessee, which had ratified the 14th Amendment, were placed into 5 military districts under Union generals. Each former Confederate state had to write a constitution that had to give the right to vote to all adult male citizens, and it had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Fearing that Johnson would not enforce the Military Reconstruction Act, Congress passed the Command of the Army Act that required all orders from the President to go through the headquarters of the General of the Army. Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act that required the Senate to approve the removal of any official appointed by the President that required Senate confirmation. And this brings us now to Johnson's impeachment. Johnson becomes the first president ever impeached, and only the second, or I should say only 2 have been impeached. Now, many people think that Nixon was impeached, and that isn't true. Nixon resigned, but Nixon was facing impeachment and a likely conviction in the Senate. The only other president to be impeached was Bill Clinton, who was impeached by the House of Representatives, but was acquitted in the Senate. And this is ultimately what happens to Johnson as well. So Johnson challenged the Tenure of Office Act by firing the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, who supported the Congressional Reconstruction Plan in February of 1868. The House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson for refusing to uphold the Tenure of Office Act and with trying to undermine the Reconstruction program. After more than 2 months of debate, the Senate vote was 1 vote short of conviction. So even though we have impeached 2 presidents, both of them survived a trial in the Senate. And now we look at Ulysses S. Grant. Johnson did not run for re-election in 1868. General Ulysses S. Grant was the Republican candidate. Union troops in the South protected African Americans' right to vote, and Grant won the election, and the Republicans kept control of both houses of Congress. Congress proposed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which said that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous servitude. The amendment became part of the Constitution in 1870. By 1870, all former Confederate states had rejoined the Union. During Reconstruction, many Northerners moved to the South. Many were elected or appointed to positions in state governments. Southerners referred to these Northerners as carpetbaggers because some of them brought suitcases made of carpet fabric. Many Southerners viewed the Northerners as intruders who wanted to gain from the South's post-war troubles. White Southerners who supported the changes in the South were called scalawags. Many African Americans became active in politics, and many served in public office. African Americans in the South established churches which became the center of their communities. The Republican Party became powerful in the South and started many major reforms, including repealing the black codes, establishing hospitals, and rebuilding roads and railways damaged during the Civil War. Many Southern whites resented the influence of African Americans and the Republicans in the government. Some Southerners organized secret societies, such as the Ku Klux Klan, to undermine the Republican rule. Klan members used acts of terror to frighten supporters of the Republican governments, including African Americans, white Republicans, carpetbaggers, scalawags, and anybody else who supported Republican governments and equality for African Americans. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed 3 enforcement acts to end the violence in the South and made the activities of the KKK illegal. Liberals in the Republican Party began to disagree with the party and left to join the Democratic Party. Grant won the election of 1872, but his second term was rocked by scandals. The Panic of 1873 caused many smaller banks to close and the stock market to fall, leading to a depression that lasted until the end of the decade. In 1874, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives and gained seats in the Senate. The Republican candidate in the election of 1876 was Rutherford B. Hayes, who wanted to end radical Reconstruction. The Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden. Neither candidate won a majority of the electoral votes. Due to widespread election fraud, it was hard to tell who won. The Compromise of 1877 allowed Hayes to become president, and the Republicans agreed to pull federal troops out of the South. Hayes pulled federal troops out of the South, ending Reconstruction, and looked to end the sectionalism that had divided the nation. Northern investors helped to rebuild the South, and new industry was started, and railroads rapidly expanded. After Reconstruction ended, African Americans returned to plantations owned by whites. Some worked as sharecroppers, receiving a portion of the owner's crops, while others worked for wages or became tenant farmers, renting the land that they farmed.